like to present Dr. Vijaya Musini and Dr. Benji Heran, and they're from the Therapeutics Initiative, and they'll be talking today about clinical study reports and how they should be used in Cochrane systematic reviews.
So the title of our talk today is, Should Clinical Study Reports be Included in Cochrane Systematic Reviews? So I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Anesthesiology, Pharmacology and Therapeutics. I work for the Therapeutics Initiative in the Drug Assessment Working Group, and I'm also the one of the editors of the Cochrane Hypertension Review Group. I have no conflicts of interest.
Hi, I'm Benji Heran. I'm here to present briefly. I'm mainly a sidekick with Vijaya today for this presentation. I'm a contract researcher. I actually had done my PhD with the Therapeutics Initiative a while back. And so I'm currently working part-time with the group again, and I have no conflicts of interest either.
So going to the objectives of today's talk. So we will be providing information on various sources available for reporting clinical trials, and I think we will focus on clinical study reports. We'll help you understand reporting bias in medical literature, and then answer the questions, can clinical study reports help sort reporting bias? We'll be talking about Cochrane reviews and should CSRs or clinical study reports be included in Cochrane reviews. Benji and I both will be giving several examples. I'll give two personal examples that I faced. So in terms of reporting of clinical trials, the most readily available and most frequently accessed are journal publications. However, over 50% of clinical trials done are not published. So you have to keep that in mind. Then there is the other source of information are trial registries. So you have the European Union Clinical Trial Registers, started in May 2004. The FDA Amendment Act in 2007, so we have the clinicaltrials.gov website where trials get registered. And then some of the manufacturers also have study registers, so I've just listed one manufacturer, GSK. Then there are industry-sponsored results database. So the clinical study data request.com is something we are used for the Eliskiren review, the example of which I'll be showing later on. And Eliskiren was also a drug by Novartis. So we had looked at the Novartis clinical trial results database, which was really helpful to get some unpublished studies. Then there are regulatory authority websites, the FDA and the European Union one, and we use the FDA quite regularly to look for information. In talking about clinical study reports, so they are done mostly for industry trials, and Roche provided clinical study reports following growing concerns of their products with Tamiflu, and Benji will be talking about this example in much more details. In 2010, the European Medicine Agency was first to agree to an open access policy to confidential documents, including CSRs. And then there is individual patient data. So what is a clinical study report? It's an intermediate document between raw data and journal article. It's routinely created for industry trials, and it's submitted for marketing authorization of investigational medicinal products in the European Union, in Japan and US. They are relatively straightforward to navigate because of their standardized and structured format. So what they provide is comprehensive summary of trial methods, analyses and results. They follow the ICH E3 guidelines for structure and content. They are mostly prepared by specially trained staff, and the quality of reports is high. They are substantially more detailed, so they have hundreds of tables, figures, and a large volume of appendices. And since they are not constrained by page limits, you can have up to thousands of pages of CSR for each trial. So a CSR exists only for drugs and biologics, but not for non-pharmacological interventions. And unfortunately, publicly funded trials do not usually produce a clinical study report. They are not usually publicly available, and they are less well known in academic community. I'll be showing a survey where about over 85% of people did not know that clinical study reports existed. Several studies demonstrate that CSRs provide the greatest breadth and depth of information versus journal articles, trial registries, or grey literature because of no page limits. There were several articles that provided information, but for lack of time, I did not include them. So coming to the main concern of reporting bias. So reporting bias is selective reporting of research based on the nature and direction of the results. So trials with unfavorable results are less likely to be published. And even if trials are published, there is selective outcome reporting bias because unfavorable outcomes are less likely to be reported. This leads to the published evidence often being incomplete or skewed towards a positive spin. And this is a major threat to validity and credibility of systematic reviews. So Jefferson in 2018, he looked at 348 systematic reviews that were published in 2014 and found that 75% of these 348 systematic reviews relied solely on published data. And these systematic reviews, when we do only on published data, perpetuate such reporting bias.
For the next few minutes, I want to talk to you a bit about the Tamiflu Saga, which started about 10 years ago now. And Ben Goldacre, who's a researcher, physician, and science writer in the UK, referred to this as the poster child for a missing data story. And it's a rather interesting and shocking at the same time story, which really exemplifies, one, the need for full transparency of clinical trials. That includes the study design, the analysis, and the findings. So the full information, and also, most importantly, access to that information, which is easier said than done. So to put it in context, Tamiflu came to the market in the States in 1999. And for the first few years, it came to Canada afterwards, and for the first few years, it wasn't a particularly well-selling product. However, that changed very quickly around 2005, where it was touted as being the key intervention for use if there was a pandemic, influenza pandemic. And some of you may recall, it was the bird flu was all the rage back then. People were genuinely scared of the possibility of a pandemic, and that was supported by the media reports that were, again, supported by the public health officials stating that this is going to happen. It's inevitable. It was a doom and gloom situation, and every few years you'd be hearing about this. And the only line of defense was Tamiflu. At this time, there wasn't a vaccine available, and the reason for it being considered the only line of defense is that the claims that were made. One is that the first claim was that Tamiflu reduced complications associated with influenza. That's predominantly pneumonia. And there was also a claim that it prevented transmission. So coming to the first one, in terms of reducing complications, that was something touted by government agencies, including the Center for Disease Control in the US, as well as in Europe and in Australia. And the notion that this drug reduced transmission or prevented transmission was something that the WHO supported and used as their basis for mass prophylaxis planning and sort of promoting that globally. In red, you'll see there that these claims were all based on one source. And this one source was an industry-sponsored meta-analysis that was published in 2003. And it pooled the data from 10 randomized controlled trials that were done in the late 90s. So Kaiser 2003, this pooled meta-analysis, concluded that Tamiflu reduced secondary complications as well as hospital admissions. On the other hand, there was this an opposite conclusion made by the FDA at the time that they were considering this drug for the market, that using the same data, using the same 10 RCTs as their evidence to make a decision, they concluded that Tamiflu did not reduce complications and that it did not prevent transmission of influenza. So it makes you think, well, how can you have these two disparate conclusions based on the same body of evidence? Fast forwarding a bit, we come to 2009. There was a scare of H1N1, and so the countries around the world started stockpiling and spending billions of dollars in Tamiflu in an effort to prevent a pandemic from either occurring or at least minimizing the impact of it. At that time, the UK and the Australian government approached the Cochrane review authors who had published this systematic review for an update. And at that time, in 2008, the previous version of the review demonstrated that there was some evidence of a reduction in complications with Tamiflu. Then the saga was all initiated, it was sparked by this one comment from a Japanese pediatrician who, just backing up a bit, the Cochrane Library has a mechanism where you can provide feedback very easily for any systematic review. And so this Japanese pediatrician did so. And what he stated was that your conclusions are largely driven by this one source, Kaiser 2003. So that the authors at that point realized that we need to look at this more carefully. At the time, it was not uncommon for secondary sources of publications in terms, it could be a pooled analysis or some other form than a bona fide journal article that reports on clinical trial data, for that secondary source to be included in a systematic review. And that's what these authors had done. So they realized that that was not probably a good idea. They admitted to their credit that that was a mistake. And so they approached the authors of that meta-analysis for the complete information. And they never received it. The authors replied back that we don't have the information. Please go to the manufacturer. They also approached the two published reviews, published RCTs that they identified, and same answer. We don't have the information. Please ask the manufacturer. So that's herein lays the long protracted story here, in that the authors approached the manufacturer, Roche, and requested the complete information. And it was a long and arduous process. It took a number of years, which I'll get to. But ultimately, the manufacturers responded with an excerpts of the CSRs. And right from that point, they were able to determine that there were glaring issues with the evidence that wasn't provided in the published report. And what they found was that these patients were unrepresentative of the real world. Typically, with influenza, you're primarily concerned about the elderly, young children, and those with comorbidities, those with cardiopulmonary disease. And these were highly selected, very healthy patients that were included in some of these trials. They also, some of the studies were labeled as double-blind, but as you can see, they used pills that were different colors for the active treatment and placebo. And thirdly, there was concern about the way that pneumonia was diagnosed. In several studies, they simply relied on the patient to report whether or not they had pneumonia. And I think that you don't really have to think too very much. That's highly unreliable. So given that, there were inconsistencies from what was reported in the CSRs, in those excerpts of the CSRs, versus what was available publicly. The two studies that were published simply stated that there were either no serious adverse events, or they reported no adverse event data at all. But when they dug into the CSRs, they were able to identify a total of 10 serious adverse events that occurred in these two trials. And there was also a very large phase 3 trial that was included in the CSRs that was never published. So Roche, ultimately with back and forth with not only the Cochrane authors, but also BMJ, who teamed up with the Cochrane authors to try to get this information, involving journalists, trying to make this as public as possible. It took them 5 years to finally get the data. And once they did, they found some pretty depressing information here. So firstly, they had insufficient data to see if Tamiflu had an impact on deaths. But they also were able to conclude that there was no reduction in the number of hospitalizations with Tamiflu. And there also was no evidence to support that there was any reduction or prevention of asymptomatic spread or transmission. A subset of the studies that use this flawed approach of self-reporting of pneumonia, they concluded there was some modest benefit, but when they actually looked at the 5 trials that used a more robust approach and had a form where there was more reliable adjudication of the pneumonia, those studies demonstrated no benefit of Tamiflu. There was a reduction, I think it was around 16 hours in terms of the duration of the symptoms, but this is at the risk of increased adverse events associated with Tamiflu, which includes vomiting, headache, and psychiatric adverse events. So the Cochrane Review authors, based on their long and stressful experience, they concluded that the answer lies in the CSRs and not in the published reports, for the obvious reason that they had the full information. So I just want to present quickly 2 examples of other studies that have been done, comparing CSRs versus what was available publicly. So in Germany, they have a health technology agency that conducts these reviews for whatever drugs are submitted for market approval. And they routinely request the CSRs for these assessments. And so they set out to compare what the information provided in the CSRs for randomized controlled trials for, I think, 16 health technology assessments from 2006 to 2011. And they took those CSRs and identified the publicly available reports and compared them for information on outcomes. So they identified a total of 101 trials with full CSRs, and of those, 15 of those studies were not published. There were 86 published with at least one publicly available source, either that's a journal, a publication, or a summary or registry report. So this table demonstrates that clearly the CSRs provide more information on outcomes than the publicly available sources. So for benefit outcomes, 84% of the CSRs provided complete information on the benefit outcomes listed below, whereas only 35% of the publicly available sources reported complete information on those outcomes. Likewise, for harm, 87% of the studies or CSRs reported on harm data, whereas only 43% did for the publicly available sources. So the authors concluded that, no surprise, that the CSRs provided more info than the publicly available sources. They also observed that the rate of publication of studies increased over time, but there was no improvement in terms of the amount of information on these particular outcomes that were being reported over that same period. So they concluded that CSRs are required for full evaluation of the studies. Another study was looking at duloxetine for major depressive disorder. This is a group, Peter Gotch's group, if you know who he is. And they were able to, they set out to compare if there were any inconsistencies between the CSR information versus what was available publicly, as well as they compared it versus the protocols. So they identified 9 placebo-controlled trials for duloxetine for this particular indication that were submitted for market approval to the EMA. And they requested for the full CSR reports as well as the protocols if available to the EMA for these 9 studies. And then they searched the electronic databases for publicly available reports. And they also searched clinicaltrials.gov and contacted the manufacturer if necessary for more information. Then they extracted the data that was available in all these different formats and compared them. And so what they found was that the CSRs provided full information on the primary efficacy analysis as well as for major harms listed here. And they provided more complete information on major harms that, as you saw in the previous study, that was missing in a majority of the publicly available reports. And they also were able to detect that there was publication bias in terms of the benefits that were associated with the use of that particular drug. So as you can see, the conclusions are more or less the same as the other study, in that we have incomplete reporting of harms especially, as well as for benefits, and they, in comparison with publicly available reports, and CSRs ultimately should be used for full evaluation of the drugs.
So I'll go back to our objectives about Cochrane reviews and inclusion of clinical study reports. So to have high quality systematic reviews, the first requirement is comprehensive information on methods and results of the study. So typically Cochrane reviews only include journal published articles. I'll be showing you a survey that will prove that. And CSRs are rarely included. And we have shown you now examples of insufficient data in journal publications. So it misrepresents efficacy and harms of drugs and leads to meta-analysis potentially being unreliable and misleading. So I published a review in the Cochrane on blood pressure lowering efficacy of renin inhibitors for primary hypertension. So typically the research question in Cochrane reviews is in the PCOS format, participant, intervention, comparator outcomes and study design. So based on published and unpublished double-blind randomized controlled studies with a duration of 3 weeks or more in adult participants with primary hypertension, does monotherapy with different fixed doses of aliskiren as compared to placebo reduce systolic and diastolic blood pressure in a treatment duration between 3 and 12 weeks. We had several secondary outcomes in this review, is on blood pressure variability, pulse pressure, heart rate, and then we wanted adverse events in terms of mortality, non-fatal serious adverse events, total adverse events, withdrawal due to adverse events, and we are specifically looking for dry cough, diarrhea, and angioedema. So there are 2 updates of this review. So it was originally published in 2009, and the first update was done in 2011. The second update is more recent in 2017. And the first 2 original review and the first update, we only included journal published information. And for the second update, we decided to include published and unpublished reports and to include data from CSRs if they were available. So to seek the CSRs of published and unpublished trials, we requested the European Medicine Agency under Access to Document Policy and submitted request. We looked at clinicalstudydatarequest.com. We looked at the Novartis Clinical Study Results Database. We also looked at the FDA site clinicaltrials.gov, and there was an FDA medical review available. So we looked at 5 different sources of information, and we did obtain CSR from European Medicine Agency, but it was not available at the same time. It was over several months, over a period of 2 years. So in all, 12 studies were included in the 2017 update in over 7,400 patients. The mean duration of treatment was 8 weeks, and the doses for aliskiren that were available was from 75 milligrams per day to 600 milligrams per day. The maximum approved dose is 300 milligrams per day. So we had 12 studies that met the inclusion criteria. Only 10 out of the 12 studies were published in journals. 2 studies were not published, but we found them because they were both registered with clinicaltrials.gov, and we found them in the Novartis Clinical Trial Results database. And luckily, results were posted, because many times results are not posted on clinicaltrials.gov. For one of these unpublished studies, we did get a clinical study report from EMA. And in terms of the 12 studies, we only got 9 CSRs for the 12 included studies, out of which there were 10 published studies, but we had CSR of 8 published studies and the 1 unpublished one I spoke of earlier. So when you include CSRs, due to my personal experience, I wanted to share you have lots of issues that you have to deal with. First of all, multiple sources of data for each included study. So the CSR, the journal publication, the clinical trial result database and clinicaltrials.gov. You have to read the information in all 4 and see if there are any data discrepancies. Again, when in the first 2009 and 2011, I had identified studies like the trial publication, like if the author's name Little John 2013. But when we looked at all these various sources, there was a Novartis database identifier. You can look how long it is. So I'll just say study 2305, the last 4 digits. Then it was registered with clinicaltrials.gov. There's an NCT number. And then it was published as Little John 2013 as a journal published article. So if we decided early on in the protocol that if we found data discrepancies between different sources, we would use data from the clinical study report. And also in terms of obtaining the CSRs, it was placed in a queue. So 3 CSRs were still not available. And I've talked about the delay in getting them. Also, despite waiting for so long, not the whole CSR was given. It was partial, there were missing appendices, and individual patient data was not provided. So what it does is when you have differing amounts or availability of information, in terms of risk of bias assessment, we did it using Chapter 8 of the Cochrane risk of bias tools. So for the 12 studies I'm accounting for, 1 study had no journal publication or CSR, so our risk of bias assessment was based on the results database, which has very less information. It's a synopsis of the study. 1 study had no journal publication, but since CSR was available, we could do risk of bias assessment based on the amount of information available in the CSR. 8 published study, the CSR is available, so we did it based on the CSR. And 2 studies are published, but CSR was not available with EME. These are the Little John 2013 and the Puke 2009 study. So just listing my 3 reviews in 2009, 2011 and 2017 as the second update. I had 6 studies included in the first original review, 8 studies in the first update, and if I had not looked for unpublished information, I would have 10 studies in 2017. So I had 2 extra studies based on the information. And for the 8 published studies that I had CSRs, I had much more information now on those trials than I would have in the journal publications alone. So in terms of decrease in systolic and diastolic blood pressure, we didn't find much difference. And we also graded the overall certainty of evidence. And we said it was moderate certainty for the 75, 150 and 300 milligram dose and low certainty for 600 because we had very less data. In terms of blood pressure variability, there was no effect. Heart rate and pulse pressure, we had absolutely no information in 2009 and 2011. And in 2017, we had information only from 4 of the 12 studies. So the 5 other CSRs did not provide this information, so it may be available in appendices that was not available to us. However, we had information on mortality, serious adverse events, other adverse events, and in terms of specific adverse event diarrhea, we found a significant increase in a dose-dependent manner, and the 600 milligrams was statistically significant. The risk was 7 times higher than placebo. So we had conclusions besides blood pressure lowering efficacy on the adverse events. So did using CSR in ALISCAR in 2017 review, what changed? There was no change in terms of blood pressure efficacy analysis, but we did have more accurate information on blood pressure variability because you need to use standard deviation. So we had a lot of missing information, or we imputed because it was not present in the published journal articles. So we did get much more accurate information on blood pressure variability, but it did not change the blood pressure efficacy analysis. And withdrawal due to adverse events. Additional information on adverse events we got for mortality, non-fatal serious adverse events, total adverse events, and all the specific adverse events listed. And we also got reasons for withdrawal due to adverse events. So compared to the 2009 and the 2011 review, I have 4 tables, tables 7, 8, 9, and 10, which gives all details regarding what was the cause of death, what were the serious adverse events that occurred. And it was also very helpful in grading the certainty of evidence. So based on the information we had in 2017, we downgraded blood pressure evidence from high certainty to moderate certainty and low certainty for adverse events. So the next question to ask was it worth including CSRs? I would say yes and no. Yes is data on adverse events significantly improved. Data availability on variability of blood pressure, we got additional information. And also in CSRs, there's a lot of information on subgroup analysis. So we did get information based on age, based on gender, based on race. Risk of bias assessment was more accurate and complete, and there are more complete information for overall grading of evidence. So CSR should definitely be included. But the cons are there was huge delay in completing the review. A lot of time and effort was required to go through various documents of each included studies, and blood pressure efficacy data did not differ from the previous versions. I have one more example of TORCH study. So there's a TI letter 109 on do long-acting beta agonists better than placebo in adult patients with COPD. For that, my purpose of putting this slide is there's a New England Journal of Medicine publication which is 15 pages long for the TORCH study. And the TORCH study actually, the weight of this study in the meta-analysis was over 80%. So I was very much interested in looking at the details. And GSK has put a lot of CSRs on their website. So I found it on their website. This single study is 5,481 pages long. It has hundreds of tables and figures. This study was also registered with clinicaltrials.gov, and there was an FDA review. So looking at moderate to severe exacerbations in COPD patients, that's one of the goals of treatment. So what the New England Journal of Medicine reported was on the mean rate of moderate to severe exacerbation per patient per year, and the rate ratio was highly statistically significant. The company had information on number of patients with one or more moderate to severe exacerbations, which was the outcome we were looking for in our protocol. So it was not there in the New England Journal of Medicine. So what I did not read all the 5,480 pages of the CSR. It's quite impossible to do. So you have to put a framework on what information you're looking for, and it was provided in one of their tables, 7.028 on page 1171. So what it showed was there was absolutely no difference, 68% in the salmeterol plus fluticasone group and 69% in the placebo group. So this information is conveniently missing from the New England Journal of Medicine. So this is, the next slide is online survey of systematic review researchers, and I was one of the respondents, so I was interested in seeing what were their findings. So of the 160 respondents, this is an online survey, 93% of the respondents were Cochrane review authors or an editor, 70% were in academia, 40% were clinicians, and 15% methods research. So here 87% have never considered using CSRs. So because they are majority Cochrane reviews, only 20 out of 160, which is 13%, have previously requested or used a CSR and other regulatory documents from FDA or EMA. And the motivation to use CSR in these 20 people was due to concerns about publication and selective reporting bias. And they also identified barriers to using CSR because there is limited access, time and resources needed to go through the CSRs, and also lack of guidance of how to use them. So the conclusion of this survey was, although authors agree CSR are important and valuable source of information, very few use them because major barriers exist. So the next question to ask was, what are steps being taken to overcome reporting bias? So thankfully, there's widespread international support for data accessibility. And in 2004, medical journal editors determined that only registries would be published, which would force people to register their trial before the actual study was conducted. And data sharing commitment was done by some of the pharmaceutical companies listed there. And because of the FDA amendment in 2007, in 2008, we had the clinicaltrials.gov, so that results, the trial results could be posted there. And it's supposed to be posted within a year of completion, but if you go to the website, this is good. In 2014, the European Union Clinical Trial Regulation wanted trial data to be publicly accessible in a searchable format, and all related data and documents, including trial protocols and clinical study reports, should be included and linked together by a European Union trial number. In 2015, BMJ decided to no longer publish trials of drug or devices if authors do not commit to make relevant anonymized patient-level data available. So this is one additional step than even clinical study reports. So in 2016, EMA has posted 132 CSRs of 132 medicinal products, and which were submitted after January 2015. So what it shows is, even for the older trials that are done and the systematic reviews we have, we need the information of clinical study reports to be posted. And as recently as October 15th of this month, Health Canada decided to post CSRs within 120 days of decisions, starting with drugs that contain novel active ingredients, and devices and other drugs will be phased over 4 years. So I provided the website information. And then there are other efforts to improve access to trial data. You have the WHO International Clinical Trial Registry. There's a Yale University Open Data Access. There's Duke Clinical Research Institute, World Trials Campaign, and OpenTrials.net. I'll talk a little bit of All Trials Campaign. This was started by Ben Goldacre, is one of the co-founders, in January 2013. And to overcome systematic flaws in clinical research, they have wide support in the academic press like BMJ and PLOS have joined them. And they want all past and present trials to be listed in a registry and results shared as open data. They have recently been working with Science and Technology Committee of the UK Parliament. And what they want to do is, besides manufacturers, they also want to monitor universities and institutes' progress on publishing clinical trial results. So what the UK committee has decided that they would call heads of the institute that are falling short after 6 months to come to the parliament and explain why the results are not yet published. And dozens of institutes, so on the positive side, many institutes are now contacting all trials for guidance and support on how to report results from old trials. So to come to the key message that we wanted to give today, CSRs minimize impact of publication and selective outcome reporting bias. Several examples given by both me and Benji show to the importance of including CSRs in systematic reviews, because that will change data interpretation and conclusion. And you could do a more accurate risk of bias assessment and comprehensive analysis and interpretation of benefits and harms of drug therapy. CSR should be publicly available, and we think Cochrane should encourage use of CSRs in systematic reviews. Thank you. So Benji, you want to come in? If anybody has any questions. So there are different ways of reporting acute, moderate to severe exacerbations. There are many other issues with how of that outcome, but that was not the goal of my presentation today. But what is important is to know number of patients with one or more moderate to severe exacerbation, which tells you when you do a mean rate. If you had, suppose just hypothetically, if you had two patients, one had 10 exacerbations and one had none, and you do a mean, it would be 5 exacerbations per patient, which does not represent anybody, right? So it's not that we are saying the mean rate per patient per year is not important. It is important, but you need data on number of patients with one or more exacerbations so you can put it together. So if it does not, it is not significant. This trial contributed more than 80% of the weight, and this trial was a trial with the least risk of bias, so the high quality trial. So I would then more believe on this trial than the other smaller trials for a shorter duration of time. This was done for over a year. It's different, right? In number of patients, it's the calculation, the statistics used is different than calculating the mean rate per patient per year. So how many exacerbations each patient had, and over the treatment time, it could be different for each patient, right? Because some patients leave early. So it's a statistical thing. So it is, if what I want to show you is the same outcome is looked at in different ways, you could arrive at different conclusions. But what you want is what you think is important. So in our protocol, what we were looking for is number of patients with one or more moderate to severe exacerbations. And then there are issues around how exacerbations were defined differently in different trials, how they counted, what should be the time interval between one exacerbation and the next one. So there were a lot of other issues. You could read my PI letter on 109, and you can see I've listed quite a few things there. Okay. Yeah, Aaron?
I was going to say, if the format of CSRs is structured, could you give a link to that, what that structure looks like? So
no, I've not given the link. Okay. Yeah, so we can provide that.
Okay, that's good.
Because it's this ICH E3 format, so all have to follow. So publicly done trials don't have a CSR. So even if we say include CSR in Cochrane reviews, it's again limited to certain drugs which were included for regulatory authority, so then those are the only ones that is available. And you looked at even when I did the renin inhibitor review, although 10 studies are published, we could get CSRs for only 8, right? So it was not available even with EMA. I don't know the reason why. And it's very hard with CSR when we have to place requests and they go in a queue and order. And then, so I and Kendra thought that, we should ask multiple people to put in the request. So we are like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But, we were learning. This was our first experience. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So you need so when you do a systematic review, you need to have your own protocol and define what is your hierarchy of outcomes, right? And then you look for specific information of what you require within the CSR. The only good thing about CSR when I looked at is, although there are hundreds of tables, the title of the tables is very helpful. So I looked for, moderate to severe exacerbation. There were few tables, but to see which one could provide me that information. So, but if you don't apply a framework, you can easily get lost in. I don't claim to be an expert in looking at CSRs. I don't have any training in it. So probably you should take some training if, and I think even for our dog reviews, but there is limited time and resources, right? Because for each study, if there are, like thousands of pages and you have like 20 studies, it could be a lifetime's work to do, right? Yes, go ahead. So there's an Equator organization that trains people in looking at clinical trial data. So I don't know if anybody has experience with, yeah, so Lori.
So I just wanted to say that IQWiC, which is the German Health Technology Assessment Agency, has given a number of workshops on clinical study reports for Cochrane people, as well as for example, the International Society of Drug Bulletins. So I think some of the slides are available online. There's a specific structure to clinical study reports that can be used, and which makes actually searching fairly simple if you go through them. Yeah, one other comment, there is a clinical study report working group in Cochrane now, which is encouraging the use of clinical study reports, but what we find is that it's very labor intensive, so we're trying to advocate for doing clinical study reports for some topics, but not all topics.
Thank you very much. That will end our talk.